Well folks, another decade is gone and video games are still doing what they do best, giving us more reasons to get mad at shit in life. I won't dispute that there have been some great heights reached in gaming over the last 10 years, but looking back it's certainly hard to ignore some of the industry's most tragic and moronic moments throughout, especially when some of it is on full display for us all. While it would be nice to celebrate some of the best hurrahs over the last few years, we simply can't help but gorge ourselves on the utter failures of others. And folks, we've got them all, from failed MMOs to bankrupt studios, from unplayable games to the scammiest of games. There's more than a tale or two to get one's blood boiling here, that's for sure. For clarity, this video will indeed be about me mostly recapping some of the biggest stories to have come out over the last decade, with some more personal impressions on each year wedged in between it all. But let me make this clear that I'm not going to be talking about every minor failure that has turned up over the decade, though some of that might come from how each of us differ from one's failures. I'm aware that not all of these are the result of some greedy executive looking to shake as much money out of us as possible, but merely a simple case of mismanagement in some form or another. Sadly though, a mistake can and will most likely still be pretty embarrassing for you and your company at the end of the day, and failure to acknowledge it does little to help you move forward. Now, I decided not to include any unresolved court cases or uncertain allegations that are still pending as of this time, as new information can always change how one perceives things. Also, I'm going to be keeping this as close to the gaming industry as I can. This means barely any stuff focused solely on games journalism or YouTube/content creators. So none of this, and especially none of this. I'd rather not be flooding the comment section with any more gasoline, thank you. So won't you come with me all to a forgotten time where motor control was considered a good investment, horse armor was seen as the most scandalous form of microtransactions, and EA was pretty much the same as they are today. So I don't know much about you guys, but to me, 2010 was a tad bit of an underwhelming year. And I want to emphasize the me bit out of that, because looking at the games this year gave us, I can understand if you feel the exact opposite. I'd be lying if I said I felt like it was Christmas all year round for me. Still though, it was a significant year nonetheless, though in terms of controversial stories, I can't say much based on what I was able to dig up. Hell, maybe they actually were simpler times back then. It was a great year for Microsoft, dropping tons of games throughout the year, reminding me of a time when they didn't just rely on Halo, Gears and Forza all the time. As for Sony, while there was little in terms of heavy hitters in the later half of the year, they made up for it with their latest in a long line of original ideas, and the indie game scene continued to grow and influence the industry in many ways, with games like Super Meat Boy helping to expand on players' more colourful vocabulary, and Limbo showing us if you keep everything in your game super ambiguous and vague as possible, you can create an entire corner of the net just to deconstructing every semblance of detail left bare. Don't forget your obligatory giant red arrows and circles, kids. But onto those fails now. The biggest thing to have gone down at the start came with Activision having lawsuits from both Infinity Ward founders Jason West and Vince Zampella, as well as several employees. While West and Zampella would come to an agreement with Activision in 2012, the company would end up paying out $42 million to the many current and former staff members of Infinity Ward for unpaid bonuses. Of course though, while Activision had their problems, EA wasn't too far behind with their own, starting a decade of continued disaster after disaster, with one of their first coming about after it was revealed that their newest entry to the Medal of Honor series would be having gamers play as the Taliban as part of the game's multiplayer. After much backlash, including from the US military who had banned the sale of the game from multiple military bases, the issue was easily resolved by simply changing their names to Opposing Forces, almost as if the Taliban were never there to begin with. One game many, like myself, may have forgotten about or were simply unaware of was that of APB All Points Bulletin, a game that looked to take the developer of Real-Time Worlds past works with the original Crackdown and create a fully online open-world third-person shooter where players would get to create custom characters and engage in street wars with one another. It was certainly an ambitious project, but as we'll see, those words are usually not met with the kindest of outcomes. The game was constantly delayed, receiving criticism for its costly subscription service, and by the end of it, it was marked at costing Real-Time over $100 million to develop. A review embargo was also set for 1 week after the game's release, release, something that many picked up on as a way of keeping players from catching wind of the game's buggy and unfinished state. It was all meaningless in the end, as Real-Time Worlds was shut down barely 2 months after the game was launched, with APB servers being suspended 1 month later. APB would end up being purchased by K2 Network and be relaunched 1 year later as APB Reloaded, swapping out its subscription-based model for a free-to-play one. And in yet another attempt to knock World of Warcraft off its MMO throne, Square Enix launched Final Fantasy XIV to the world, quickly becoming one of the studio's biggest financial upsets since 2001's Spirits Within. The game received heavy criticism over its grindy and uninventive quests, confusing interface, and total lack of direction, with the only positive thing that many could agree with being its decent visuals. It was a poor way to start off at, and over time, little would be done to save it from its eventual fate. After much time had passed, the devs came to the conclusion that with the game's current engine and servers, the only remedy for Final Fantasy XIV was to start again and rebuild it from the ground up. On November 11th, 2012, the servers were finally shut down, with the game even working in a narrative reason as to its rebirth. Final Fantasy XIV: A Realm Reborn would launch itself in August of 2013, and in a stunning turn of events was met with lavish praise this time around. For as much as a costly disaster the game may have started off as, Final Fantasy XIV has since become one of the most successful and celebrated MMOs of the last decade, continuing to add new locations and classes to the still ever-growing fan base.
I mean, you had something that not a lot of people liked, and everyone wanted to forget about it. So rather than, just taking that and doing it over, and just reimagining it, why not destroy that?
Now, I may not have been all that wild about 2010, but 2011 was definitely a golden year in my mind. This was a year that just felt like everyone was on their A game. I remember on the holiday period having to really think hard about which games to pick out first, but just went ahead and bought multiple games each time. With that said, it was a year where original games were not that easy to find considering the amount of sequels we got to everything. By September it was like, you get a third game, and you get a third game, you all get third games. One of those sequels would come from Valve, who would proceed to ignore any of their franchises afterwards, so as to spend precious time counting up all that Steam sale dough. Bethesda returned once again to share with us another tale within the world of Tamriel with the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim, a game that would be milked to death to the point that the original Sonic the Hedgehog, Rayman 2 and Minecraft would call it overkill. Speaking of which, it was this year that the simple yet surprisingly popular world of Minecraft was given a full release, inspiring many over the next few years to rip them off in all shapes and forms. One game that stood out for its unique approach was that of Team Bondi's L.A. Noire, a game that not only sought to capture the feel of a classic American crime story filled with murder and deduction throughout, but he also used advanced facial capturing technology to aid in revealing whenever a character may be lying during the game's interrogation scenes. While the game was met with fair praise, it will be revealed that its development didn't come under the best of conditions. A month after the game's launch, many revelations started to surface in an article by Andrew McMillan for IGN Australia. In it, multiple former staffers came out about the hellish work conditions they were put in, with many devs having just started in the industry. Much of its problems came back to the studio's founder and creative director Brendan McNamara, with many describing him as a bully, easy to temper, and would micromanage everything, causing staff to leave due to the level of stress he would put on them. McNamara would disagree with the accusations, claiming he was just simply voicing his opinion and that it was his game, therefore he had the right to demand change whenever he wanted. In the wake of the expose, the International Game Developers Association, or IGDA, set up an investigation into Team Bondi's work conditions. By August 2011, Team Bondi was liquidized to become a part of film production house Kennedy Miller Mitchell. While L.A. Noire did decently well both in sales numbers and with its critics, the studio's mistreatment of its staff, unforgiving work hours, and unpaid overtime would be how McNamara and his studio would be remembered. 2011 also marked a miracle of sorts, as the long and semi-awaited Duke Nukem Forever was at long last released. A game that began development all the way back in 1997 and would spend the next 14 years in a manic and frustrating development cycle of swapping game engines mid-development, rights being passed around, and release dates getting promised only to get pushed back further each time. As the years would go by, George Broussard, one of the creators of the original Duke Nukem and producer for Forever, would be pushed to his limits in his ongoing feud with Take-Two. After having the game be worked on by multiple companies with staff being paid the bare minimum, the game would see Gearbox Software be the ones to finally push it over the finish line at long last. To this day, it still holds the Guinness World Record for the longest development development period for a video game. As expected, the game was met with mediocre scores, mostly stemming from its out-of-date gameplay mechanics, along with Duke's cringy sense of humour. As profoundly sexist as Duke may have been though, it's not like you'll find anything of the sort lingering around in the game's code. That was not the case however with Techland's open-world zombie game Dead Island. While looking through the digital version of Dead Island's code, it was discovered that one of the female playable characters, Pruna, once had one of her unlockable skills under the name Gender Wars originally be titled Feminist Whore. The publisher Deep Silver apologised, calling the matter a private joke amongst the game's programmers. Of course though, nothing sours your reputation any more than when a mistake can end up potentially placing your consumers at risk. In January of that year, Sony sued hacker George Hotz for publishing information on how to jailbreak the PS3, which Sony feared would promote others to potentially pirate on the console. This caught the attention of the hacker group known as Anonymous, who felt that the move by Sony was an attack on free speech. Between April 17th and April 19th, hackers had digitally broken into the PlayStation Network and Sony Online Entertainment servers. The attack was only noticed till the 19th at 4:15 PM, leading the PSN to being shut down in all regions so an investigation could take place. On the 26th, Sony finally opened up about the damage that the PlayStation Network had suffered, as well as how much personal information was now compromised, with over 77 million users' names, addresses, passwords and credit cards now exposed. It will later be revealed on May the 2nd that on top of these 77 million PSN accounts, another almost 25 million SOE accounts had also had their information stolen. After 23 days, the PSN was brought back on May the 14th, with the company apologising via 2 free PS3 and PSP games of a set based on each user's region. Suspicion was naturally placed on Anonymous for the attack, though the group denied any theft of credit card information over claims of it not fitting in with their creed. The scandal was so unavoidable that Sony had no choice but to address it in their opening monologue at that year's E3. By the end of it, Sony had lost around $171 million, along with having multiple lawsuits filed against them. The public's trust in them in regards to their online security, as well as their decision to withhold information about the breach early into the investigation, left many shaken by the events.
The last few weeks have been tough for all of us. And please know that we're doing everything we can to fully restore network services around the world and to regain your trust over the days, weeks, and months to come. I appreciate your time and support. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Open up about something that I had wrapped around my head for the longest time. For a while, I often saw a pattern to each year in video games as to whether I found them to be successful or not, and it was simply odd number years good, even number years not the best. This wouldn't last forever, mind you, but it did stick for a while. 2012 was more of a year in which the few games I appreciated were ones that I can see many saying they cared little for. This year was certainly an example of how invested gamers had become with storytelling within games, as fans of the Mass Effect series were given quite the surprise ending to its third entry. And while the game was given free DLC to alter things in the end so as to soften the blow, it sadly did little to erase the game's final 15 minutes. Well, better 15 minutes than a whole season, I say. Both Sony and Nintendo would look to continue their success with their newest gaming platforms that were, well, we'll get to that in a bit. Blizzard's Diablo 3 ended up receiving a good bit of backlash over the decision to force players into always being online thanks to the inclusion of digital rights management, or DRM for short, something that would lead to many failing to even log in on day one of the game's release. Many were also unhappy with the addition of the auction house, which many saw as Blizzard forcing upon pay-to-win mechanics. The auction house will later be removed in March of 2014, but would still keep the game's DRM policy in place for PC, though would later allow offline play for its console versions. THQ, known for publishing multiple game series like Saints Row, Red Faction, Darksiders, WWE and many more, were finally at their rope's end when they were forced to file for bankruptcy near the end of the year after too many financial setbacks. While a good chunk of the blame was placed on the company's efforts to push the Wii accessory U-Draw as the next family-friendly craze, it was ultimately a simple case of things just getting worse and worse as time went on, with very little in the way of success, along with millions being lost each year. The beginning of the next year would see them liquidating many of their licenses and studios, with many being purchased by other big names like Sega, 2K, Crytek and Ubisoft. Eventually the THQ name would get a second wind as the trademark would be purchased by Nordic Games in 2014, with the company renaming itself THQ Nordic a few years after. Over the next few years, the newly resurrected THQ will look to revitalise many of the games it had been associated with in the past, mostly by re-releasing them for PC and current-gen consoles, as well as attempting to continue franchises like the Darksiders series. Another publisher that wasn't doing so well back then was Capcom, who was beginning to have the spotlight put on many of their shady practices, in particular their use of on-disc DLC. For context, during the beginning of the decade, many developers started including already finished DLC codes as well as online passes into game boxes as a means to push consumers away from buying pre-owned games. The practice didn't go over well, with many not liking the idea of finished content being withheld in this manner. The most notable examples came from Street Fighter X Tekken containing already finished fighters tucked away, and Resident Evil 6 with its no-hope difficulty setting. Capcom's reasoning was stated that it was merely a means of saving hard drive space, a response that many saw as a hollow excuse for getting caught out. In the vein of the successful DayZ, multiple open-world survival games would crop up on occasion. One that stood out from the most, for the wrong reasons, was that of the cleverly named The War Z. Both the game and its developer, Hammerpoint Interactive, would receive heavy criticism not just for its blatant pay-to-play mechanics and buggy launch, but also for clear false advertising, along with the developer's way of silencing any negative feedback by threatening players with bans. With all the surrounding the game, it's no surprise it would find itself getting pulled from Steam later. The year would also see the Silicon Knights vs Epic Games lawsuit come to an eventual end, with Epic Games taking home all the marbles. After the utter failure of Silicon Knights 2 Humans, the company took it upon themselves to sue Epic in 2007 over problems related to the Unreal Engine 3 that affected game development. Shortly after, Epic would countersue Silicon over them being well aware of the engine's capabilities after its launch, but also that Silicon used unauthorized use of the engine as well. On May of 2012, Epic beat Silicon's lawsuit and won its countersuit for $4.45 million. On top of that, Silicon was ordered to recall and destroy all copies of 2 Human and X-Men Destiny. The court case would be the final blow to the already deflated developer and would file for bankruptcy 2 years later. On the subject of studios going bust, it was hard to miss the utter implosion that took place that year with the short-lived 38 Studios. Founded by retired Major League Baseball pitcher Curt Schilling in 2006, the company was born out of Schilling's love for MMORPGs like World of Warcraft, along with help from several creative minds such as author R.A. Salvatore and comic book creator Todd McFarlane. Another factor in play to helping push 38 starting their first game came with the acquisition of Big Huge Games from THQ, as well as a loan of $75 million from the state of Rhode Island. Eventually their first game, Kingdoms of Amalur Reckoning, was released in February of 2012, meeting mild critical acclaim. However, in the end it was not enough to meet the 3 million unit sales target the state had set out in order for them to break even. With the game failing to meet expectations, along with the millions in unpaid debts, 38 Studios declared bankruptcy in May of that year, with it being estimated of over $133 million being burnt through up to that point. In a bid to play catch up with the current gen market, Nintendo did all they could to bolster the successor to the highly popular and profitable Wii, and their answer came in the form of the Wii U. The console made promises of being even more powerful than the PS3 and Xbox 360, as well as a heavy inclusion of more third-party support, something the Wii started to lose much of during its later years. The Wii U would hit store shelves in the 2012 holiday season, and as the months went by, it became more and more clear from comparing the sales numbers between the Wii U and its predecessor that the console was headed for a rough next few years. By 2013, many of the big third-party publishers that Nintendo had boasted about during their announcement for the console, such as EA, Ubisoft and Bethesda, opened up about their decision to have more of their games focused on the next-gen gaming consoles rather than the Wii U, with some even admitting they would only commit more once they saw evidence of higher sales numbers for the console. Although the console would see cuts in its price, along with many critically successful games like Mario Kart 8, Bayonetta 2 and Super Smash Bros, there was little that could be done to turn this ship around. Many, including then at the time President of America Reggie Fils-Aimé, pointed to the console's marketing as a key factor as to why it found little adoption within families. The console would be discontinued in January of 2017, and by mid-2019 the console was marked at having only sold just over 13.5 units worldwide, with both the PS4 and the Xbox One managing to reach those same sales numbers almost a year after their launches. Of course, it wasn't the only piece of new hardware to come out that year that found little attraction. The PlayStation Vita, which looked to continue on from the surprisingly successful PSP, aimed at duplicating over the same experiences that one would find on the PS3, the same way that the PSP attempted to do so with the PlayStation 2. One of the first things to hurt its reputation came with the news that the handheld's 3G model would be supported by AT&T in the US, which many weren't too thrilled about given AT&T's reception with their first few years with the iPhone. Another problem came with the price, but not so much with the Vita itself, but more so with the Vita's memory cards, with the 4GB version coming in at $19. Despite the price drop and a revised model, the Vita was still doing little to grab people's attention. The lack of third party was bad enough, but as the years went by, even Sony started to almost ignore its existence, with the company placing almost all their efforts towards keeping the PS4 from ever falling the least bit behind in the console race. Production was finally discontinued in March of 2019, with it being reported to have only sold 18 million units worldwide, coming out incredibly short-handed when compared to the 80 million that the PSP sold in its 10-year lifespan. It was only recently that CEO Jim Ryan confirmed that the company showed little interest in pursuing another handheld, at least for the while anyway. Both devices will remain as a black spot on their respective company's almost spotless record and serve as a reminder that name alone can't save you unless you're willing to step out of their shadow first.
It has Super Mario 3D World, The Legend of Zelda The Wind Waker HD, and Rayman Legends. Oh, yeah. And it comes with 2 free games. Hot buttered popcorn, that's a deal.
If I were to use a word to sum up this year, it would be bloodbath. Right out the gate, Sony and Microsoft had their knives drawn on one another as both console makers were simultaneously ready to kickstart the next generation of consoles. Both had a lot to prove that they had learned from their past mistakes, as well as doing what they could to differentiate each one's product from one another's. However, this feud did little to distract from some of the decade's biggest hits. One that needs no introduction is Grand Theft Auto 5 that hit the scene in September, breaking multiple records, one of which becoming the fastest selling entertainment product to earn over $1 billion, and that's just for the PS3 and Xbox 360. Cinematic games were steadily becoming more accepted outside of the gaming community bubble, with games like The Last of Us, Gone Home, and Brothers: A Tale of Two Souls making a great case for what video games can achieve through storytelling. Not to mention Beyond Two Souls reminding us to still keep the skip button close by. One game that ended up making numerous appearances on people's worst of list that year was that of Aliens Colonial Marines. Since the game production began, it was stuck in development hell, most in part to it being leaked later that Gearbox had essentially diverted resources that were meant for Colonial Marines towards Borderlands 2 instead, and simply outsourced a good portion of the game to other companies, only to take back the reins near the end. The game also got into some legal trouble, as many happened to notice the striking difference between the final product and the demo that was shown off at E3 2012 that the head of Gearbox, Rennie Pitchford, claimed to be actual gameplay. One of the most abrupt cancellations that year came with the news that Fez 2 was no longer moving forward. The move came about after game creator Phil Fish engaged in a heated online feud with game trailers Marcus Beer over Beer's insistence that indie developers should give their opinion on Microsoft's recent reversal of their indie games publishing policy, going so far as to label Fish as a hipster. And while name calling is certainly never any grounds to getting someone to open up to you, Fish had built up a reputation over the years for his hot temper and use of social media to decry any who would attack him during his time on the original Fez. Today it serves as a warning to other devs, whether they be indie or AAA, to not ingrain yourself in online clashes, as they will very likely just end up doing more harm than good for you and your company. In October of 2012, Disney went ahead and added another notch to their ever-growing conglomerate by purchasing Lucasfilm and all properties under them. This move, while exciting at the time, would lead a few months later to the legendary game studio LucasArts being relegated to almost all but its name to license out properties to other devs from now on, putting the hopeful Star Wars 1313 to sleep forever. A few months later, things would get even more concerning as Disney agreed to an exclusive multi-year license with none other than the cuddly innocent EA. While Disney would license out Star Wars to a few developers intended for the casual games market, all core games would have to run through EA until 2023, that is unless their deal is renewed. Of course, EA couldn't let a year go by without looking like idiots as we saw the beloved SimCity series have new life brought into it. However, much like the year before with Diablo 3, it felt the need to include DRM into its game. What's more, just like Diablo, the game launched with many not being able to play the game due to constant network crashes, along with a game featuring plenty of modes in which players could easily play without the need for online. Within a few months, modders had already found ways to make that dream a reality, leading to an offline mode being introduced 1 year later. But of course, that wasn't the only story that year to bring up the heated discussion of DRM inclusion. By the first few months of the year, the idea of both Sony and Microsoft's next-gen consoles, including DRM functionality, was fearfully becoming more and more reality. While Sony kept their cards close to their chest with their console announcement, Microsoft came out confident that things would work out and consumers would come to accept the norm, as it were. After the rather embarrassing Xbox One reveal on May the 21st, where TV took up a significant portion of it, Xbox outlined their plans to have games be licensed to each player's console, trading games no longer becoming a simple act between two friends, but a complicated mess, with activation codes being needed and games having a 30-day deactivation. What's more, in order to even play games, you would have to have your Xbox One connect to the internet at least once every 24 hours. Many, especially those living in more rural areas, were mad and confused, and that it was too much hassle to simply control the video game resale and trading markets. Many in the company tried to spin the message, but did little to sway people. When then at the time President of Interactive Entertainment Business Don Mattrick was asked about those who couldn't meet the requirements the Xbox One was demanding, he simply directed them to picking up an Xbox 360 instead. Things would go from bad to worse as Sony confirmed at E3 a few weeks later that there would be no DRM support and no use game restrictions for the PS4, leading to one of the biggest blows to Microsoft. On June 19th, Microsoft finally caved and backtracked on their decision, but unfortunately the damage was already done. The bad word of mouth from its reveal, along with the price gap due to the Kinect 2.0, led to the two console sales numbers getting further and further apart from one another as time went on. While the Xbox One would gain some favour back thanks to its integration of backwards compatibility and Game Pass, the lack of notable exclusives would do little to garner attention, with many of their biggest games constantly getting delayed or cancelled.
And fortunately, we have a product for people who aren't able to get some form of connectivity. It's called Xbox 360.
It was at this moment he knew. He fucked up.
One of the biggest problems I find with new consoles is that almost all the time the first 12 to 18 months can feel incredibly barren for both first and third party games. And considering both next gen consoles came out at the very end of the same year, 2014 was most definitely an underwhelming year to say the least. While I may not have been too thrilled with 2010 or 2012, I can still confidently say there were landmark games in those years that helped raise the bar for video games. Not to dismiss it entirely, but I find it amusing how Dragon Age Inquisition got the majority of Game of the Year awards that year, and yet I don't seem to hear but a peep about it from people today. It wasn't all doom and gloom though. While Sony and Microsoft's absence was noticeable, Nintendo took this opportunity to get some much needed love for the Wii U, much of which would just find itself being ported over to the Switch years later, but we'll try to look at that as a glass half full. The age of Kickstarter games was in full swing, with Shovel Knight getting released, marking one of the last few times a Kickstarter game was completed in under 3 years and actually managed to meet fan expectations. And thanks to Bungie's newest IP, Destiny, the open world MMO looter shooter blueprint would go on to be the decade's most overused way to pitch a game. In the world of video game marketing, many saw an opportunity to bank on the rise in online content creator influence. Not only were many more of them starting to get given early review copies to big AAA games, but some were also given sneak peeks and demos to help promote them. However, unlike brand deals, one thing was made clear, that publishers and developers were to always have paid promotions be disclosed to their viewers/readers and to never directly intimidate or influence them into giving positive coverage. Warner Bros., however, decided to overlook this detail in the lead up to the open world Lord of the Rings based game Shadow of Mordor. It was only until the now late Total Biscuit blew the whistle on the promotion that people were even aware of this going on. The Federal Trade Commission began doing more digging into these deals, with ending in Warner Bros. Getting given a stern talking to and told to always direct promoters to disclose their sponsorships. Warner Bros. Weren't the only ones that year having been caught exploiting YouTubers, as it was also revealed that Microsoft was also pulling similar tactics in order to spread more positivity in regards to the Xbox One. The specific deal was made between Microsoft and online media company Machinima, where a number of its partner channels would be swayed into using footage from Xbox One exclusives, along with mentioning the console by name. Channels were also prohibited from speaking out against the console in a negative way, and forbidden from mentioning the agreement. The scandal came to a conclusion similar to the one with Warner Bros., but with Microsoft at least claiming they were unaware of the guidelines not being followed. AAA games and consoles weren't the only ones to rely on positive feedback from YouTubers, as the indie market had come to especially see them as an easy, reliable, and well, cheap source of promotion. But with that said, many of those online rogues were certainly not ones to mince their words. Journalist / YouTube personality Jim Sterling found himself in Homicide Studios' crosshairs when he lambasted their latest survival shooter, The Slaughtering Grounds. Touching quite the nerve, the developer naturally figured they were liable to sue Sterling on the grounds of assault, libel, and slander for $15 million. Not one to roll over and play dead, Sterling refused to back down and ready for whatever they thought they had against him. Eager to add even more enemies to their list, the developer went on to then sue 100 other Steam critics who dared to speak their mind about their game. Steam, easily seeing this as a threat against its users, removed all of Homicide Studios' games in response. The suit against Sterling would be thrown out in what can probably be described as a complete and total waste of the man's time. The decade was no stranger to people in the industry finding new and creative ways to persuade gamers into buying useless digital garbage, and with mobile games like Clash of Clans ranking in millions by the day, many saw it as a blueprint to capitalise on the Wild West-like mobile market. Not every game though got away scot-free, especially those based on a much beloved franchise. One of those in 2014 was EA's Dungeon Keeper Mobile, which did much to aggravate fans of the series by shoving pay-to-play mechanics right in people's faces. It also didn't help that EA had made it so that if you wanted to give the game a user score lower than 5 stars, you would be directed to send an email to them so as to submit your rating. It was a mighty unlucky year for Ubisoft, as multiple AAA games under them that year received a good bit of criticism thrown at them. Much of the buzz all centered around the horrendous state that year's Assassin's Creed game, Assassin's Creed Unity, was released in. It was a buggy mess with every kind of topping, clipping, facial animation, frame rate, NPCs, you name it. There was so much negative coverage over the game's many bugs that Ubisoft promised free DLC to all players along with a free game had they already gone ahead and bought the season pass. Another game that got a not so positive reception from players was that of their latest IP, Watch Dogs. The game was met with a wave of hype behind it thanks to the stunning reveal demo that was shown off at E3 2012. As the final product drew near, the game showed little in terms of the gorgeous open world that was expected, with modders later finding files in the PC version that would have slightly improved the game's rendering. Despite the outcry for the two games, both still sold well enough, continuing on with sequels in the future, but the stain of Ubisoft's early demonstrations compared to their end products would pop up many more times to come. In the long line of Kickstarters failing to meet expectations, the king of failed expectations, Peter Molyneux, entered the scene with his newest god simulator, Godus. Like with many popular video game Kickstarters, the game was touted as a spiritual successor to the lead designer's past works, in this case the Popular series. The game suffered from poor planning and, to no surprise considering Molyneux's record, failed to reach many of the Kickstarter goals they had set themselves. The real issue, however, came in its relation to Molyneux and his company's previous endeavour, Curiosity: What's Inside the Cube, an experimental mobile game in which players would attempt to dig their way through a cube made up of billions of layers of other cubes in order to unlock what was buried within. The first to reach the centre would earn a life-changing prize, which as it turns out was to be the all-powerful god to all gods in their next game, Godus, as well as receiving a portion of the game's revenue. However, when Godus failed to make a decent profit, the winner, Brian Henderson, was left in the dark for ages about his supposed earnings, with it finally coming out that he was in fact to receive nothing due to the game's poor sales performance. It was another low for Molyneux's declining reputation, and while he does acknowledge his past mistakes, too many have been made throughout the years he has been a part of the industry. While ambition is a valued trait, trust is another, especially when you're making people feel like fools for sticking by you.
Mixing all those things together just to get to this one simple idea, to create a real living being in a computer.
You sit on a throne of lies.
Hey everyone, so it was my intention to have this video come out before the end of the year, and after doing the math, I saw myself not meeting that deadline, with everything from work to holiday with the family taking priority. So in order to get this video out at the time I intended, I had to make the hard decision to cut it into 2 parts. I like to think I'll have the rest of it out for you within a week or so, but if you want to catch it right when it comes out, I can think of more than a few ways to stay up to date when that happens. So I hope you all enjoy yourselves this Christmas with your loved ones, and I'll be seeing you all very soon.